It's bang on 8:30. On the way here on Evenings on ABC Around Tasmania, continuing the conversation about bushrangers in Tasmania, the long and infamous history. After Sam Smith, and I'm not the only one on Evenings. Sam Smith on Evenings on ABC Radio Hobart and ABC Northern Tasmania. Mel Bush with you. Great to have you along on the show tonight. It's 27 to 9. You just heard from Dr. Dean Al-Hajiri, gastroenterologist and hepatologist, talking about hemochromatosis, and great to get your texts too. And one texter saying, so refreshing to hear an eloquent, knowledgeable specialist willing to answer our questions. Where can we contact this doctor? You have the name. I'm sure if you get onto Dr. Google, you will find Dr. Dean. And yes, he is eloquent and particularly knowledgeable, no doubt. You'll hear from Dr. Dean again in the not too distant future. 26 to 10, from hemochromatosis to bushrangers. Up next, author Aidan Phelan and the next instalment of our Tassie Bushranger series. And it's a tale of twos.
Breakfast with Rick Goddard.
Andy Gall.
I'm not in the media scrum.
Where are you?
I've snuck out and I'm in the queue with the bona fide people who are going in. You're a serial news swimmer.
I am, yes.
The sea hags are here, Rick.
Hi, Andy. It's my first time, and I came the first year that it was on.
Just starting to beat the big drum. There's over 1,500 people as they're just building to the... Oh, here they go!
Rick Goddard, Monday to Thursday from 5:30am on ABC Radio Hobart.
On ABC Radio Hobart and ABC Northern Tasmania. You're with Mel Bush.
25 to 9. Tasmania's bushranging history dates back to the early settlers, as you'll hear from my next guest, Aidan Phelan, author of Glenrowan and the website A Guide to Australian Bushranging, in a continuation of our series on these local rogues of the shrubbery. Some operated alone, others in gangs, but tonight you'll hear about a couple of notorious duos who held parts of the north and south of the state to ransom in the late 1800s. Aidan Phelan, welcome back to Evenings. And let's start tonight, Aidan, with Henry Bradley and Patrick O'Connor. Who were they, Aidan?
Hello. Bradley and O'Connor. They're kind of infamous. A lot of people probably have heard of a place called Bushrangers Bay on Cape Schanck, but they probably don't know the story behind it, which is that it was named because of this pair of bushrangers. So they were operating in 1853. They weren't around for very long, only a few months, but in that short span of time, they were able to commit 6 murders and 28 robberies. So
that's not bad.
Yeah, that's a pretty
busy,
successful outing. Yeah.
Just going back a moment, Aidan. You're talking about for those new to Tasmania or not in the area. Can you explain the area you're talking about when you were saying it was named for this duo?
Yeah. So Cape Schanck is on the coast of Victoria. So when Bradley and O'Connor went to Victoria, that was where they landed. They'd actually stolen a ship and managed to make it all the way across the Bass Strait in one piece. And so, yeah, that's why they called it Bushrangers Bay.
So where did they actually meet one another, Aidan?
Well, from what I've been able to gather, they met each other very early on Norfolk Island. So they sort of had tangential lives up to that point. Bradley was an orphan. He was a London pickpocket who was transported as a teenager to Point Pure. And O'Connor, from what I've been able to gather, was a settler who committed some crimes that got him sent all the way over to Norfolk Island. But once they were there, they met up and they hit it off. So when they got their ticket of leave, they came to the area around Launceston and decided that working wasn't for them. They were going to take to the bush.
So it was a case of they met as youngsters and then reconnected a little later in life. Is that the case?
That seems to be the case, yeah.
And so can you hazard a guess when they decided to embark on this life of a robbery spree, essentially? Can you take a guess at how old they might have been?
Now, my understanding is that they were both in their early 20s. Bradley had come out as a 16-year-old. So, we're talking some very young men, and they were quite short as well, only in their sort of the lower end of the 5 foot. But they were clearly quite determined young men. It was not very typical, actually, for bushrangers to be over the age of about 25. Most of the time they were either caught or shuffled off the mortal coil before they got past their majority.
And Aidan, why, do you know, did they take to the bush? Was it simply the fact that they were lazy and they didn't want a job?
It's a good question, and I haven't been able to work it out because, they had their ticket of leave, which is usually a pathway to freedom. But obviously they decided that they weren't happy labouring for someone else, and they were determined to get out of the colony because once they went to the bush, their trajectory went upwards to the circular head. So they obviously had a very clear idea that they wanted to get out of Tasmania, but they probably didn't want to work honestly once they were over the Bass Strait.
And I find that interesting because in terms of, determination, Aidan, did they not walk to Circular Head?
From what I've seen, there's sort of a mixture of walking and riding, but mostly walking. They tended to steal horses from time to time. At one point, they actually stole some draft horses because that was all that was available. But I don't imagine they would have been particularly good at riding horses, given that they wouldn't have had much opportunity as convicts.
Well, what I'm also thinking, Aidan, and taking nothing away from those of small stature, but you said draft horses and that these gentlemen were on the lower end of the sort of 5 foot arena. That was a challenge in and of itself. They're walking to Circular Head and endeavouring to get on some of the largest horses in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, I haven't seen anything that described them stealing step ladders, so I'm assuming it would have been quite difficult for them.
I reckon it would have been. And just so predominantly they were robbers. They weren't particularly violent.
Oh, they were very violent. O'Connor specifically was responsible for a lot of the, I suppose, carnage is the right word to use, during one robbery. So the one where they actually got the draft horses. The reason that they weren't able to get any better horses was because the guy that was supposed to get the horses for them refused, and so they shot him in the arm. And the wound was so severe they had to amputate it. So there was this sort of maliciousness, at least on the part of O'Connor. On one of the occasions where they had their first murder, the owner of the house that they were robbing had escaped out the window, and because O'Connor missed when he was firing at him, he said that he had to be satisfied and he shot someone else instead. This is a very, very violent man, and he was the one, when they eventually went on trial, that confessed and took all of the responsibility for the murders on himself.
So chances are he may well have been, one of the early psychopaths, Aidan.
I would say so, yeah.
So what became of them? What became of Bradley and O'Connor?
Well, they did manage to successfully get all the way across to Victoria, and they made it as far as Melbourne. Things sort of fell apart pretty quickly because the men that had taken them across, they didn't last very long. And what ended up happening was that once Bradley and O'Connor were in Victoria, they continued their crime spree. They obviously decided that, they found a good thing over there in Tasmania, they'd keep it going. So they performed another series of robberies and murders, and eventually, after the police caught up to them, there was a bit of a conflict, and after some struggle, they were captured and sent to trial in Melbourne. And they were hanged in October of the same year at the Old Melbourne Jail.
And again, Aidan, crime doesn't pay. It's 18 to 9. My guest is Aidan Phelan, author of Glenrowan and the website A Guide to Australian Bushranging, talking about a couple of bushranging duos in Tasmania, and another duo, Aidan, that came pretty hot on the heels, as I understand it, of Bradley and O'Connor, were James Dalton and Andrew Kelly. What was their background? Kelly, a notorious name.
It's a very popular name amongst bushrangers and their supporters, it seems. But no, these two were convicts. They had been brought out, and they obviously served quite a lot of time in prison before they decided to go on the run. But their career as bushrangers started when they escaped from Port Arthur, which was supposedly escape-proof. But the amount of times I've read of bushrangers getting away from Port Arthur means that probably not as effective as they thought it was. But as they were escaping, they had to go across Eaglehawk Neck, and as they were swimming, the other two men that they'd escaped with disappeared. They're either drowned or eaten by sharks, they don't know. But by a miraculous turn of events, Dalton and Kelly managed to get to the other side, and they headed straight towards Campbelltown.
And so incredibly lucky convicts for the time being, Aidan. Were they, talking about previously just how violent the other two were, Bradley and O'Connor, were these guys, James Dalton and Andrew Kelly, were they bad men or were they just desperate?
From what I've been able to find, they were mostly just desperate. They were nowhere near as violent as Bradley and O'Connor, and in fact, it's surprising that so little violence actually took place during the many robberies that they did, because much like some of the older bushrangers, their modus operandi was to go to a farm, bail everyone up, and keep them under guard while they raided the house. On one occasion, which is probably the most infamous outing, they went to Bonavista in Avoca, and they stuck up 30 people, including constables, and robbed the house. But that was the only time I've been able to come across where there was actually any killing, because one of the constables, a man named Thomas Buckmaster, tried to capture Dalton, and in the scuffle he was shot. And in the end, that was actually the thing that brought them undone.
And so, generally speaking, Aidan, is that the area that these two operated in, or did they get around a little bit?
They seemed to get around a little bit. They were mostly operating sort of on the run, because much like Bradley and O'Connor, they were trying to find their way out of Van Diemen's Land, although it was still being colloquially known as Tasmania at that point. So a couple of times they sort of operated around, I think, Stony Creek and Fingal and a few places around there, but they managed to eventually get a whaleboat. And in order to sail this whaleboat, they had to get someone to sail it for them. So they abducted a quartet of miners and basically forced them at gunpoint to sail across Bass Strait, which would be quite a terrifying thing.
It would be incredible. It's daunting for the best sailors, even in modern times, Aidan.
Definitely. So to think of them in this rather a small craft, because a whaleboat was basically a fishing boat, and they're out there in the middle of the ocean. None of them are experienced seamen, but somehow they managed to get across, and everyone survived. So
two brushes with potential shark deaths, and they've managed to get through both of them. I'm gathering though, the good luck isn't going to remain with them, Aidan. They were destined to return to Tasmania.
They were, and it all came apart in a very Melbourne fashion when Dalton decided he was going to try and exchange some currency in a coffee shop. So he obviously had Tasmanian currency, because at that point each colony had their own type of money, and that was because each colony was run almost like a separate country. So for him to be able to buy things without being traced, he needed to get rid of the Tasmanian money and get sort of a more universal currency. So he was trying to exchange the money for gold, but he was recognised, so he was dobbed in, and the cops caught up to him. And a little while later, Kelly was also picked up. He had shaved to try and change his appearance a little bit, and he was using a pseudonym. But as much as he liked to pretend that he was someone else, he was pretty obviously recognised. So they were both caught, and they were sent back to Tasmania, and they were put on trial for the murder of Thomas Buckmaster and found guilty. And so they were hanged the same year as well.
So these duos, did the days of Bradley, O'Connor, Dalton and Kelly, did they almost mark the end of the days of bushranging in Tasmania, Aidan?
Yeah, it was sort of the last little burst of bushranging that you would typically find in the annals of Tasmanian history. That little period from the 1850s through to the 1860s. So as the gold rush was going gangbusters up there on the mainland, all the bushrangers focused their activities up there. And so you did occasionally get, the odd spot of bushranging in Tasmania, but the heyday was long gone by the end of the 1850s.
Well, Aidan, it's always fascinating to hear about Tasmania's bushranging history. It has, as always, been fantastic to chat to you. Thank you again, Aidan Phelan, for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Aidan Phelan, the author of Glenrowan, and also fascinating information on the website, A Guide to Australian Bushranging, including some information about Tasmanian bushrangers as well. It's 11 to 9. You're on Evenings on ABC Radio Hobart and ABC Northern Tasmania. Still to come, going to take you on a tour of Devonport, no less. However, not the Devonport you know and love in northwest Tasmania, but Devonport in the UK. I wonder if you've ever been there. I'd really like to hear from you if you have and your thoughts on Devonport. Did you enjoy it? What's it like? I'm going to catch up with an historian, Chris Robinson, after the 9 o'clock news, who is an historian of the Plymouth region, and have a conversation about the history of the town/city of Devonport. 10 to 9 on Evenings around Tasmania.